So I'm going to say a little bit about what we know so far about the impacts of the new immigration system. It's obviously this is a very broad topic. I'm going to focus mostly on how it's affecting overall migration, and then particularly work and the labour market. We heard obviously in the previous panel about the EU settlement scheme, which is the other major sort of piece of the post-Brexit jigsaw puzzle when it comes to immigration. So I think probably a good place to start is what was the post-Brexit immigration system designed to do? And during the development phases, if you look at the political debate around the time, either during the Brexit campaign itself or during after the referendum, the scheme was being developed, the main argument, there were a couple of different kinds of arguments that came up about what the system ought to do. The major theme was that immigration rules should be the same for everyone, so there should no longer be discrimination between or different rules for EU and non-EU countries, but that there should be a single system for everyone. Now, some people argued that effectively this would mean you could introduce selection criteria for EU citizens, and that would create the space, however defined, political space, or something else, for a liberalisation of non-EU immigration. This was the argument. There was a lot of curry houses always came up in this context. We'll have vote Brexit, save the curry houses, and I think a lot of people sort of chuckled at the time. I was like, yeah, are you really going to do that? And in fact, it did happen, as I will explain. There has in fact been a liberalisation of non-EU immigration policy. There were different camps among those who supported Brexit and the introduction of the end of free movement. Not everyone was consistent on the idea whether this is a way to reduce overall immigration levels. Some people said, the reason that we want to do this is we want to bring down immigration in the UK. Other people said it's not so much about the numbers, it's about the idea of control. The point is that we should be able to select people. So after much debate about exactly what that new system should look like, where we have got to today is that we do in fact have a single system for the most part for everyone, regardless of nationality, although there are still some differences. And that applies across the board: family, students, and work. The biggest changes to the underlying system itself were in the work area, so I'll focus on that for the most part. And here, as I'm sure many of you will know, the new system is effectively a slightly more liberal version of what previously applied to non-EU citizens. So we have a requirement for people to have a skilled job. Currently that needs to pay at least £25,600, although some occupations on the shortage occupation list can be paid less than that. For the most part, people have to be sponsored by an employer, and they have to meet the skill and the salary requirements. The main exceptions, there are two main exceptions, one for seasonal workers and the other one for more recently that came in early 2022 for care workers. On top of that, there are also some unsponsored routes that don't get as much attention in the discussion, but I think are also quite important. So most notably, the government reintroduced a post-study work visa that had previously been closed down in 2012. And that has seen very high demand, as I will explain shortly. There's also a new route called the high potential individual route, which so far has not seen large numbers, but it will be interesting to monitor. That's basically post-study work for universities outside of the UK, if they're sufficiently highly ranked. Most of those, the largest number by some distance, are in the US universities. And then we've seen some small tweaks and expansions to the youth mobility scheme, but so far, something that many of us were expecting, namely that EU citizens would be added to the youth mobility scheme, has not happened. Maybe it will in the future. So overall, looking at the policy, effectively what we've got is a much more liberal system a somewhat more liberal system for non-EU citizens, and a much more restrictive system for EU citizens compared to what the UK had before Brexit. Now, if you rewind a few years when people like me and Jonathan and many others were speculating about what this would mean for immigration in the UK, The general assumption, and I think forecasts were very consistent on this point, was that overall immigration would fall as a result of the post-Brexit immigration system. That effectively EU immigration would fall a lot because the system was so much more restrictive than free movement. And that non-EU immigration would go up a little bit. It was always difficult to know exactly how much, but that overall the decrease in EU migration would more than offset the increase in non-EU. Now, what we expected on the EU side effectively did happen. There has been a big reduction, as far as we can tell from the available stats, in EU migration. In fact, EU net migration, according to the most recent estimates, appears to be negative, so the EU citizen population in the UK is shrinking. I don't think that will continue forever. I think there's various technical reasons that it's likely to be negative now, but not long term. What I think where everyone was wrong was what happened on non-EU migration, in that no one anticipated the increase that would take place in migration from non-EU countries. There are various reasons for this. So this slide shows visa grants, which is not the same as immigration. Visa grants are usually higher than immigration levels because some people don't take up their visas and other people don't count as in the definition of a migrant of someone who moves for at least a year. Many of them are short term. But this gives us, this is pretty consistent actually with the immigration figures as well, and gives us a reasonably good assessment of what's going on. And basically, several factors came together to lead to an increase in the number of visas being granted under the post-Brexit immigration system. As you can see, one of the big factors has nothing to do with Brexit. It's what the government has referred to as the bespoke humanitarian routes, most notably for Hong Kong and Ukraine, and particularly in the first year after the UK started to come out of the pandemic, so sort of the year ending June 2022, that was actually the biggest single contributor to rising visa grants overall. As you can see, it's more recently it looks like it's starting to level up, whereas the others, work and study, are continuing to increase. But at least a decent part of the increase is not related to the post-Brexit immigration system. There's a trickier question: how much of the increase in work and study results from the post-Brexit immigration system, and how much is just other stuff that might have happened anyway, even in the absence of Brexit? On international students, I think there's a bit of a puzzle about why the numbers have gone up in the way that they have done. Initially, as we came out of the COVID, you see the numbers dip a lot during COVID, and there was a question, is this just a post-COVID bounce, people catching up, maybe people who studied remotely now getting visas to study in person in the UK. The numbers have continued to go. I think that no longer is all that's going on, because the numbers have continued to go up well beyond it's not just compensating for the dip that we saw during the COVID period. I tend to have a sort of skeptical attitude towards explanations that it's all about policy. I think we sort of look to policy explanations for things and often forget that actually migration levels change for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with policy. Policy can stay the same. Migration levels will often fluctuate within a constant set of policies. In this case, there is one possible policy explanation, which is the introduction of the post-study work visa, making the UK more attractive to international students. And I think that probably is a significant factor, although it's really difficult to know how much. The sort of main, I guess, piece of evidence for that is that the nationalities that have driven the increase in study visas, which particularly India and Nigeria, are also the nationalities that have traditionally made greatest use of post-study work visas, that are making most use of them now, and that were also making most use of them back when we had the old system around sort of 2010-11. There are other things going on. I mean, there's been an international education strategy that's aiming to try and diversify the origins of international students in the UK. Some universities also trying to reduce their reliance on Chinese students and going out and actively recruiting in other places, including India and Nigeria. So that may play a role as well, but it's really difficult to quantify the sort of relative importance of those. On the next issue, so the next one is work. Why are the work numbers going up? Again, maybe a little bit of a post-COVID bounce to some extent. But actually the biggest driver is is health and is the health and care sector. Now, some of these jobs, and particularly if you're looking at the increases in 2021, these were jobs that were already eligible under the pre-Brexit immigration system. So the NHS, has always known very well how to sponsor non-EU workers. They've done it in significant numbers, and they were doing it in greater numbers. And it's not obvious to me that that was anything to do with Brexit. What is different, I think, is care workers, and that's particularly, they're not separated out here, but in 2022, the provisional data from the Home Office is suggesting that there were more than 50,000 certificates of sponsorship issued to care workers, and that was as a result of the liberalisation. These are people who, this is care workers and senior care workers, neither of whom were eligible under the old immigration system, but are eligible under the post-Brexit immigration system. And that is quite significant. The reason that care workers in particular were made eligible was in response to shortages that had been exacerbated by, not exclusively caused, but had been exacerbated by the end of free movement. But the number of care workers coming in 2022 now looks like it greatly exceeds the number that ever came in under free movement rules. And there's you could do a whole talk just on what's going on in the care sector, which I won't, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that. So the result of all of this is that it's fed through into higher immigration levels and net migration in particular, which are unusually high, or have been in the most recent period. Now, some of particularly when you're looking at net immigration, some of that I think is likely to be temporary. There's so firstly, international students mostly don't remain in the UK forever, but they do remain for typically 2 to 3 years. And when you have an increase like this, it adds to net migration on the way in, but it doesn't yet subtract. The emigration doesn't yet subtract from net migration for a couple of years. So there's always a sort of technical reason to expect a temporary blip upwards in net migration as a result of an increase in international students. Obviously, some of them will stay, and that will contribute to net migration. The figures have suggested generally, even in periods where we previously had post-study work, less than 20% would stay. The other big uncertainty, I think, that obviously I mentioned on the previous slide, you saw the importance of the Hong Kong and Ukraine schemes. The immigration numbers there are broadly expected to decline over time, although there's, in both cases, obviously, we don't know how long the war is going to last in Ukraine, and the Hong Kong demand for the Hong Kong scheme is likely to depend on the situation there to some extent as well. But at least the theoretical expectation is that the numbers would not continue to be that high indefinitely. Actually, I'm just going to leave it on that slide because it's probably a more useful one. So I think there's some likelihood that the net migration figures would start to decrease, all else equal. Obviously, all else is never equal, right? And if you'd asked me a few years ago, is net migration going to be this high after Brexit, I would have laughed and said, no, of course not. So yeah, it's very difficult. This is not sort of a prediction. It's definitely going to happen. It's just the expectation based on the theory currently. So what do we know about the impacts of all of this? I mean, it's still relatively early days. We've basically got 2 years of data on the operation of the new system. And so I think we'll get more evidence about the impacts of the system as time goes on. I think there's reasonably good evidence that that the end of free movement was one of the factors contributing to labour shortages in 2021 and 2022. It's not the only factor. And in many cases, there were other reasons for labour shortages, in some cases due to the specific quirks of the post-COVID recovery, in some cases due to underlying problems that some occupations and industries have had, effectively creating an attractive enough offer to bring people into those jobs. And then the end of free movement sort of was one additional factor that exacerbated some of those problems that employers were having recruiting workers. There's a debate about whether labour shortages actually matter, which again is probably something that we can get into in the discussion if people are interested in it. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what's going on? We've got unusually high levels of immigration, and yet employers are complaining of labour shortages. Isn't this a big contradiction? And I think it's difficult to say, we do have decent evidence, we have decent evidence that at least in 2022, employers were in fact experiencing labour shortages, and I think probably the main explanation for this is just that the distribution is different, that many of the skilled, the workers coming in under the non-EU routes, some of them are not working at all, and that would include many of, but of course not all of the study migrants. And where they are working, often they're in skilled jobs, and the labour shortages that employers are complaining about being exacerbated by the end of free movement are more likely to be in the low-wage jobs that are not eligible under the new immigration system, or that are mostly not eligible under the new immigration system. There are some exceptions to that. Ukrainian, we have some tentative evidence that many Ukrainian workers are in hospitality, for example, which is one of the main sectors that saw a reduction in EU workers during that period. How am I doing for time, Jonathan?
We're fine for that.
Okay. So in terms of what the evidence says, so far there's relatively limited evidence on the impact of the end of free movement on wages. I think we certainly don't see any evidence that it has increased wages in a systematic way sort of across the labour market. And that is never really what the theoretical expectation was based on past research, which tends to find that immigration has a very small impact on wages. And so we wouldn't necessarily expect the end of free movement to have a big impact on wages either. The main impacts that we expect to see are things like employers effectively reducing their demand for workers in low-wage jobs that many EU citizens used to do. And that can happen either through automation, where it's feasible, through change in what they are producing to try and switch towards more, towards less labour-intensive goods and services, if that's feasible to them, or just through a change in the slower growth in some sectors than others, where the growth is being held back by a sort of limited number of workers to do those jobs. And generally, there's no optimal size of the economy. It's not necessarily good or bad if the composition, it can be disruptive for employers in the short run if they have to switch and adjust to a new business model, and some of them will go out of business if they can't do that. From a macroeconomic perspective, there's no optimal size of the hospitality industry. So there's a sort of conflict, I think, between the possible disruptions in the short run, and then in the long run, the evidence suggests actually it doesn't necessarily matter that much whether you continue to have growth in the low-wage workforce. There's another area of I think, mobility that is where anecdotally it looks like there have been quite significant impacts, but it's so difficult to measure because we don't have any data, which is short-term mobility. So these are people who under free movement rules would have been able to come and go quite easily. Sometimes this is related to trade relationships or trade and services. People, might pop across for business meetings, but that would count as work and wouldn't be allowed under the new immigration rules. Anyone effectively who's not, the new immigration system, if you've got the money to pay for it and you can handle the bureaucracy, works quite well for employers who are just recruiting traditional employees who will come and work for maybe a couple of years or more. It's not really designed to accommodate these more flexible, it's not designed to accommodate self-employment or these kind of very short-term things that have to happen at no notice. One of the examples that often comes up is, they need an Italian engineer to come and fix an oil rig and they need him tomorrow and they don't have time to apply for a visa and he's only going to be there for 2 days. And the immigration system sometimes struggles to accommodate that, although there are some, anyway, I won't go into the details of what's possible and what's not because it's fiendishly complicated, and that indeed is also one of employers' concerns about it. So, in terms of overall conclusion, I think it would still be my expectation that the overall economic impacts of introducing the new system are relatively small. But that they don't fall evenly, and obviously some sectors are much more affected than others, and I know John's going to go into this in a little bit more detail, looking at the different sectors. In terms of the policy questions about what happens next, I think obviously the debate about labour shortages has been overshadowed by other political debates on immigration that are going on, particularly about the asylum system. So it's not the highest issue on the agenda anymore, as it perhaps was a year ago. I think nonetheless it's interesting to think through kind of what are the various options. Should the government try and do something to address labour shortages and low-wage jobs, and what could they do if they did? And here there are basically two schools of thought. I think there's the one argument says, okay, shortages are causing problems for employers, the government is under pressure to liberalise. And here, I think the natural thing that people turn to is making more workers in low-wage jobs eligible for employer-sponsored work visas, particularly sector-specific ones. And I think that's partly just for political reasons that when you know exactly who the workers are, if you're talking about care workers or if you're talking about fruit pickers, when you have a sense of who these people are, it's slightly more, people understand more why it might be beneficial than if you're just talking about a scheme across the board for unspecified sectors TBD. But I think one of the things that really doesn't get properly discussed in that debate about liberalising the immigration system for low-wage work is that it is really difficult in low-wage jobs where people are tied to their employers to mitigate the risks of exploitation. There are some things that can be done, and I guess this is again something that I'd be happy to talk more about. But overall, the resources for monitoring are not very great, and when people are tied to their employers and unable to leave their job, there is evidence that, unsurprisingly, the risks of exploitation are greater. The other option, if another liberalisation option would be to just rely on alternatives like expanding the youth mobility schemes or just relying on post-study work, which is also not employer-tied and allows people to do jobs across the skill spectrum. That's the sort of liberalisation options. The other option is just to say, the government should stick to the status quo and wait for the labour market to adjust. And this is what the original Home Office position actually was when it put out its policy statement in February 2020. There was a striking statement saying that the system's going to be much more restrictive in these following ways. Employers will have to adjust. And I think there's an argument that actually in private sector jobs that that probably will happen over the next couple of years. One area where it doesn't seem to be happening, ironically, is in the public sector. So the bits that the least, I think there's been least willingness to adapt in the areas of the labour market that the government actually controls, i.e. the NHS and social care. So if you look at care in particular, it would be possible to attract more people into this occupation with higher wages, and it would require spending more money on the care sector. However, so far, at least in 2022, the main government response has not been to spend more money on the care sector, but to liberalise immigration, which suggests to me that the general recommendation that employers will have to adjust may have been harder than some anticipated.